Hello, this is a video about professional practice in contemporary art, and it comes out of multiple requests that I've had from my students to give a bit of an introduction into professional practice and what it means, as well as some practical advice about how you can approach it when you don't know where to start. This particular video is a version of a previous talk about professional practice that I gave to postgraduate students on the MLitt at GSA in 2022. And in that talk, I was asked to talk about this topic from the perspective of my own art practice. It covers a few key things, but not everything, so other additional aspects of professional practice will need to be discussed in one-to-one tutorials or future videos. This video is going to be divided into four main sections. In the first one, I'm going to talk about some broader, more philosophical questions around professional practice. Then I'm going to talk about some practical tips on creating a workflow that can help you find and apply for opportunities if you don't know where to start. Then I'm going to show how I use this model in my own career with examples of public presentations of my work. And finally, I'm going to offer two quick tips on managing the creative side of art practice. Once again, I want to mention that I'm going to use my own practice as a case study here, but just remember as we go along that there are many other ways of approaching professional practice. Professional practice in the arts is a surprisingly big and complex topic. And in the first instance, it can be useful to discuss it in terms of specific examples, but an important part of your journey as an artist and as a student, even after graduating, will be forging your own path through life as a professional artist and discovering what that means for you in particular. Okay, so to begin with, I'm going to give you some examples of the kind of work I make, just quickly. So, the main strand of my practice is a series of video performances in which I'm recording myself taking on different characters and improvising stories through the lens that new character offers me. So, for example, this is me acting as a conceptual artist who is making a case for the existence of little cube-shaped particles that you can use to measure truth. Here I was a revolutionary leader talking about the need to know when's the right time to retire and take a holiday. Here I was a woman talking about the suburban social scripts she felt herself unconsciously falling into. And here I was a member of a group of people who prefer to live horizontally. And speaking of professional practice, I'll now share with you a little video sketch of this kind that I made in an Airbnb room during a work trip.
Life and work. Is it a life and work balance? Do you have a life and work balance? If not, maybe consult somebody about it. Consult somebody and take a holiday. Today, a working woman is not a girl boss. No, you can't be a girl boss because everybody is in a gig economy now. So you have to keep, chasing the gig. That's not a boss. That's like a band. Everybody, now I'm in like a girl band because I'm chasing gigs in the gig economy. Yeah, but at least sometimes, you can have a good night's sleep in a nice bedroom. So, I'm not complaining that much, but I don't want you to call me a girl boss anymore because I only I earn 18k a year, but it's enough to live on. It's basically probably the equivalent of what Virginia Woolf called £500 a year in 1928. And she said that's all I need to write and to basically be a boss. A boss is a woman who can write fiction. So by Virginia Woolf standards, I am a girl boss. But by today's standards, you need to earn 6 figures to be a girl boss or more, So it's not by today's standards, I don't fit the bill, and nobody really measures anybody by 100-year-old standards, so I'm doomed. But whether I am a boss or a band member doing gigs, I'm a working woman. And so I have habits of dealing with exhaustion, which is, I feel weirdly proud about. But, I will complain a lot about it, but I will actually share my tips for life hacks, and not getting too tired on the job, cat naps, power naps, doing 15-minute bursts of work on the go, on the plane. And these are the sorts of tips I can give. This is my life accumulated wisdom. How to cope, how to be productive, and if not reproductive, being a girl band member. One-woman girl band member.
So, of course, the kind of work I make is also going to influence how exactly I go about thinking of myself as a professional and what that means. One of the broader issues that first comes to mind on the subject of professional practice in the arts is that these two things, art practice on the one hand and how that art practice is paid for on the other, are not so easy to separate. In casual conversations I've had about this, I often find that the question of funding one's own art practice is thought to belong to a separate world to the artworks themselves, and so is almost incidental or arbitrary with regard to artistic thinking. But who pays for art? Who is to benefit from it? Is every bit as important to the artwork as what formal qualities go into its making, because the way in which the artwork sits in the economy, the decisions and the flow of resources that go into making that artwork and its distribution is part of how the work is read, as well as part of what determines what sort of art gets to be made in the first place. The question of how my art should be paid for and by whom is probably one of the most difficult problems I've so far encountered in my career. And not just for the sake of keeping the motor of my practice going, but because the answer to this question in part determines the very kinds of artworks I'm able to make. Based on my experience, it seems to me that at present, art is often paid for indirectly through the other jobs that the artist does. Or if the artwork itself is funded externally, it is often done so through the centuries-old idea of patronage, which means relying on the benevolence or entrepreneurship of wealthy people, and on average, propagating their tastes. But this has its problems, as you can probably imagine. Here is a passage by Rosalind Krauss on how the artist Robert Rauschenberg had to deal with this problem in his work. Rauschenberg, among many other artists, has been working against a situation in which painting and sculpture have been absorbed within a luxury market, absorbed so totally that their content has been deeply conditioned by their status as fetish prizes to be collected and thereby consumed. In response, Rauschenberg's art asserts another alternative relationship between the work of art and its viewer. And to do this, Rauschenberg has had recourse to the value of time, to the time it takes to read a text or a painting, to rehearse the activity of cognitive differentiation that entails to get its point. That is, he wishes to pit the temporal values of consciousness against the stasis of the commodity fetish. This passage offers an example of the way in which the circulation of work in the luxury art market not only affects the way that work is valued in a monetary sense, but it also affects how that work is actually read. And clearly this annoyed Rauschenberg. Something happened to his work when it ended up in the luxury market that he despised, and he felt compelled to devise ways of resisting what the art market was doing to his work in a sense. One existing alternative to patronage or to funding from private wealthy individuals is public funding, such as the Arts Councils, Creative Scotland and the like. This is when public money is used to fund the production of art. But even in that case, when you look into where the money actually comes from, it's not always taxes. A lot of the money, particularly for individual practitioners like you or me, a lot of that money comes from the National Lottery Fund. These are funds collected from the proceeds from lottery ticket sales. In other words, art is effectively being funded by millions of betting losses occurring all over the country. And this, to my mind, is a really strange situation that is probably worth debating at length. As I go on to tell this very partial story from within my own professional practice, I encourage us to go on later and seek out and think and talk with our peers and our colleagues about the possible alternatives to this situation, to these two predominant forms of funding, this private patronage and National Lottery funding. It would be interesting to see how we could reimagine how our work could be embedded in the flow of value exchange between people in more positive ways and maybe participate in the formation of these alternatives. I'll share with you now some ways in which I navigated these circumstances, though it continues to be a great challenge and work in progress for me to understand myself as a professional, even at this stage in my practice. For one thing, it seems to me that there exists at least two types of professional success for an artist that are not always complementary. There is commercial success, whereby the artist earns lots of money from their work. And there is, I don't really know what to call it, maybe cultural success, whereby the artist earns a lot of cultural capital from their work. But another issue I think about very often is that this very distinction between commercial and cultural success is very closely related to another one, the distinction between pop culture and the avant-garde or the cutting edge of art. Why does the avant-garde tend to be relatively unpopular, elitist or niche? And does it have to be? At the same time, must art seeking to be commercially successful limit itself in its innovational ambition? This is something that preoccupies and bothers me a lot as I go through my career. It's relevant, for instance, with regard to what I decide is the right venue for my video work. Is it YouTube, the art gallery, or the cinema? These questions about high and low or pop and avant-garde are implicitly raised whenever I decide where to even show my work. In any case, it's helpful to me to have some idea of where my priorities and aspirations as an artist lie, because they're not the same for everyone, and it will inform what kind of opportunities I look for or how I measure my success. There's no point measuring my success based on standards that I'm not even going for, that I'm not even aiming for. So that's important to establish. What would success actually look like to you? For me personally, the focus of my work is to devote my efforts to reimagining what art can be on the basis of my art historical education and attempting to innovate on that particular tradition of human endeavour in any small way I can In short, I want to invent new stuff. I want to innovate stuff. I want to make things that haven't been seen before. So that's important to me in how I personally measure my success as an artist. The way I think about my professional life then involves creating the conditions in which this can have a chance of happening in my work, as well as managing the dissemination of that work. Dissemination means how that work goes out into the world, how it's spread out into the world, how it becomes public or presented to others. So I need to think about how I disseminate my work so that I can participate in a community of people who are either trying to do the same as me or otherwise value the effort and like to see the results of that effort to innovate, to make something original. In the original talk that this video is based on, I was asked to talk about what I've been doing since I left art school. But the truth is, I never really left. I started my BA in 2013 and I went straight on to do an MA in 2016. And after a 1-year break, I went on to start my PhD in 2019, which I just completed this year. And ever since then, I've been teaching as well in art school. These degrees have all been in art practice, and together they make up 8 years in art school, which is still the majority of my life as a professional artist. This decision to stay in art school for so long, it partly has something to do with a particular kind of career I was envisioning for myself, and that wouldn't work for everyone. So this is a particular kind of trajectory that I was going for. And it has to do with seeing myself as having a future in academia, in teaching, and in exploring, I suppose, a particular artistic identity between artist and scholar or researcher. And if you do go down this route that I've gone down, you're kind of going back to that question of who's paying for the art or where the money's coming from. In this case, it's a form of public money because you're being paid by the university if you become an academic. So in this case, it's the university who pays. In the first year of my BA, I decided that I thought arts education was actually quite different to higher education in other subjects, in that I should go into the course understanding myself to already be a fully formed artist, about to embark on a lifelong process of learning. In other subjects, like if you want to be a doctor, you're not a doctor yet until you finish the degree, then you become a doctor. But I think as you go into an art school and pursue an arts degree, you're already actually an artist. By the time you've already started, you don't become an artist, you're already an artist. So your career might as well start there and then. And in this way, I understood the first year of my education to also be the first year of my professional career. However, throughout these efforts to disseminate my work and platform it publicly, I understood that the majority of my time would still always need to be spent on my art practice itself. As an artist, as somebody who spends the majority of her day working with things that don't exist yet, right? You're making things that don't exist yet. They exist in the future. They're unknown even to you. Well, given that I was spending most of my day working with things that don't yet exist, I realized that many things were in fact out of my control. I can't guarantee the recognition of my work. I can't guarantee that people are going to get it or that, I'm going to get acknowledged for it. I can't even guarantee the quality of my work. I can't, before setting out to make a new piece of art, I can't guarantee that it's going to be a good piece of art. So there's a lot that's out of my control. The only thing that I can really control is the conditions in which the work is getting made and what sort of input I give to my practice. In turn, the portfolio is the only thing I can rely on if I want any sort of artistic recognition. So it's got to start there. The work must exist before it can be given to others to judge. By looking after the art practice, by giving it constant attention, spending time with it, giving it what it needs, I give it the best chance of coming up with something worthy of the portfolio. There's no guarantee of the kind of success I'm looking for. There's no guarantee that I'll make the kinds of artworks that I'm hoping to make, but I can give myself the best shot at it by really making the art practice itself and the quality of the practice and how and the conditions in which I'm making the priority. Even then, there's no guarantee, and that's why it's most important to me to do what I can to spend most of my time developing the art practice and relatively less time on everything else, including attempts to disseminate my work, to present my work in public. So the professional practice is important, but it completely relies on the studio practice. There's no professional life to be had if the studio practice doesn't come first. You need that work and the portfolio to be there in place first. Okay, but I'm going to leave the art practice itself for a moment in order to get on with something a little bit more practical. And the first thing I'll show you is how I went about disseminating my work since my career began. Because I had just got started at art school with my first portfolio and did not yet have a community, the first approach that I took was applying for open calls. So these are like open competitions that anybody can send work to get assessed and potentially get selected for some sort of opportunity. So that was the first thing that I went for. I was applying and sending my work off to these open calls, sending out proposals in response to prompts put out by other arts organisations or collectives. And ever since that very first year actually at art school, I have kept a record of all my not all my applications, a lot of my applications. And what I did was each year, we're currently in the folder in my archives for the year 2013. So each year I would keep a record of any application I sent off, and I would colour the successful ones green and the unsuccessful ones grey. And each folder like this contains the application I submitted, so I have a record of all my extended applications. So obviously this is the first year that I did this, and I didn't apply for that much. I just have one thing listed here. But as we go into the year 2014, there's a little bit more. You can see that I got a couple of things and I got rejected for some other things that are in grey. This is 2015. I started applying for a few more things and keeping a record of these things. This is 2016, 2017, 18, 19, 2020, and 2021. Keeping records like this enormously speeds up the time I take to apply for new opportunities, as I always refer back to earlier ones and I reuse and rework older proposals, just as the art practice itself is being reworked in a cumulative manner. This actually, I've just flipped to another slide, and in this slide, this is my, this would be like what a current year would look like. So orange would mean undecided. I haven't heard back yet from those opportunities. Now, you may have noticed a fair amount of grey coloured folders indicating quite a lot of rejected proposals. I actually worked it out, and based on the data I've shown you here, I've had an on average 29% success rate until now, meaning 3 in 10 applications are successful. But I would even say that this is an optimistic estimate, because there's a lot of rejected stuff that I applied for that I didn't record. So it's probably a lot lower than 29%. Regardless, let's imagine that this is the correct figure. It's not always easy to deal with rejection, even 71% of the time. I have learnt to normalise this sort of rejection to the point that I apply for things almost expecting it's going to get rejected. When it turns out to be an acceptance, I get pleasantly surprised. I don't take it personally, as there are all sorts of factors that can go into the selection of artworks and artists, and it's important in this part of the whole life of being an artist to have a little bit of a thick skin. And it does get challenged. Sometimes I do get quite disappointed, but it's important to think about the larger scheme of things. And in fact, it's very often the case that something that you get a rejection for many times gets accepted somewhere else, or even by the same organisation a few years later, because the judges are different, the circumstances are different, the zeitgeist is different. There's so many factors that go into the selection of certain artists and artworks over others in a competition or in an open call. Therefore, these things being out of my control, I just focus on giving myself the best chance that I can and not expecting anything so as to mitigate any disappointment. However, I did find that if I didn't manage this part of my practice carefully, it could quickly become overwhelming, just because of the sheer amount of applications I had to submit in order for some of them to be accepted. So I'm now going to share with you a workflow, like a way of working, a system, let's say, that I developed for applying to these open call applications. And this is the approach that best worked for me, and I still use it today. And it helped me a lot with compartmentalizing and managing what can be quite an overwhelming process if you don't have some kind of system for managing the workload. So let's have a look at what it looks like. This is a kind of diagram of my process. Collect, calendar, details, apply. So I'm going to go into each one of those now to make it a bit clearer what that means. Let's start with collect. So collect is about collecting as much information as you can and funneling as much information as you can about opportunities to you. What I do is I subscribe to various mailing lists. One of them, there are many, but one of them is Arts Admin Anchor. What it does is it aggregates various opportunities for artists and mails them to you on a regular basis. I think this one comes every month. And there are many mailing lists like this, and I subscribe to several. I also follow various art galleries, organisations and institutions on social media. I find Instagram particularly helpful, where they sometimes post opportunities for artists. So you can see an example here. Gasworks is a gallery in London, and in this screenshot, their latest post is an open call. So they announce stuff on their pages, and this can be particularly useful because unlike Arts Admin, which is just sending you every sort of opportunity that they can collect, the benefit of following particular spaces is you can follow spaces that you like, you know, that you've seen exhibitions there previously that you liked in particular, and that can be a good indication as well of what sort of spaces or venues might be a good fit for you as well. So if you like a particular institution and follow them, their opportunities might be more conducive or open to your work because you also enjoyed going to their exhibitions, if that makes sense. So it can be a little bit more bespoke in that sense, that you can follow in particular spaces that you like the track record of, because if you like them, then there's a bit of a better chance that they would like your work as well, as opposed to these mailing lists which are kind of just random collections of opportunities. But both are good, so I would do both. So in addition to these mailing lists and kind of following specific venues and institutions that you're interested in, I also think about the community that I'm part of and maintain an open attitude to collaborating with other curators and artists of my generation, seeking to be part of an ad hoc system of peer-to-peer support. All this means that, news about opportunities is frequently coming my way. That stream of constant information has to be in place first, right? But, and this is a big but, it would be too overwhelming and it would ultimately draw me away from my art practice too often if I was constantly looking at this, right? So what I do in this first step is I am loosely collecting. When I get an email like this, I don't look at it very carefully. I just quickly scan through the list and then I mark the opportunities that might be a fit for my work. And to manage the amount of work I have to do, in this first step, I don't look at things in detail. I just take note of the deadline and I add it to my calendar and I stop there. I move on with my day. Otherwise, if you looked into every single competition and read things and allowed it to interrupt your life in a way, I find it's not very healthy. I find it's very distracting. And so in this collect phase, I wouldn't go too deep into looking into these opportunities. I would just make a note in my calendar of the deadline for them and move on, stop looking at it. So then we go to the next step. Calendar. Okay, so let's say I found an opportunity like this BNC Digital Fellowship opportunity. So I thought, okay, that could be something for me. So I put the title of the opportunity in my calendar and I put a link to the page where there's more information about it. And I stick it in the date of the deadline for that opportunity, and then I forget about it. So as I'm doing this, as I'm learning about opportunities and sticking them in my calendar, I am slowly populating my calendar with these purple events. And these purple events are basically my deadlines. At the start of each new week, I look ahead at the week and I see if I can see any purple events. So in this example, in this screenshot, there are 4 of them. There's quite a few of them in this week. And if I do have applications to consider for that week, what I do is I set aside a day to go through them. I decide, okay, on Monday, I'm going to look through these 4 opportunities this week. Usually, I find that a week is enough notice for me to apply for a small scale opportunity. But if it's something that requires a more involved proposal, a proposal that might take several weeks to write, then I set a reminder a month in advance. So let's say I'm looking at this event here right now, this BNC Digital Fellowship opportunity, and I've decided I want to work on this. Then I click on the event and it takes me to the link, the web page for this opportunity. And here's the web page. So this is the first point in the process where I actually start to look at the details of things. And the first thing I do is I scroll down to check the section called eligibility. So eligibility is the first thing I look at because there's no point spending time on something that I'm not eligible for. So if it ends up saying something in the list like they're not accepting proposals from students, then you know immediately just to stop instead of wasting time on it. So always look at the eligibility first because that's a quick way to determine whether or not you want to keep going with this. So let's say I am eligible, then I move on and do a close read of the description of the opportunity for the first time. And I decide if it still sounds like something I want to do. So I wouldn't just spend time on applying for anything. I make sure that it's something that I feel would actually be exciting to do. If I decide that I do want to apply, I scroll on to the submission requirements and I create a checklist for myself of everything I need to do. And you'll find as you do more and more of these, you'll find that there is a kind of formula here, that most of these things are asked by most open call opportunities, right? So in my case, because I've been doing this for a few years, the things that they're asking for here, like a CV or a statement about my work or a portfolio, examples of work and so on, I actually have all of that. If you remember, I've kept a record of all the applications I've ever made. So I've already got this all written and I can reuse aspects of it and kind of reformulate applications based on the previous work I've done. But if it's your first time, then that's great as well, because when you're working on it, you know that you'll be able to use what you're creating now in the future as well, in future opportunities. So that's one positive, is that a lot of these things repeatedly asked for, things like CVs or statements or portfolios. And this will be not too dissimilar from the application process you went through to apply for a place at GSA as well. Okay, so let's say I've applied, I've completed my application, I've used some old material from my records, I've worked through the checklist, I've collected everything. What I do then is I submit the application, and then, this is important, I completely forget about it. It can be quite painful if you're waiting for a response. Sometimes you don't know how long it's going to take for someone to get back to you. And I have found personally it's important to try and actually forget about it as soon as you've submitted, so that you can get on to other things and not feel like you're hanging or waiting or raising your expectations as well. So it's important to forget about the application and to not expect any acceptance. And actually, for this particular opportunity, I did apply for this. My application was rejected. So that is the fastest way that I've been able to work through the admin personally. And using this kind of 4-step process, I find that I don't get too overwhelmed by my applications and that the work doesn't encroach too much on my studio time. And in fact, it sometimes even becomes a welcome moment to reflect on what I'm doing or imagine it in a different light. As a system, it's been the backbone of everything I've been able to do with and for other people as an artist. So here are some things I started doing as a result. This was the first exhibition I was in. It was a 2-person show that was organised by myself and my classmate in the first year of our BA, which is kind of like your second year, I suppose, because it was in England. The venue was actually a toilet, an old Victorian underground toilet that had recently been converted into an art gallery. And by converted, I only mean that they gave the art gallery a name. Inside, it was still a Victorian toilet. It's called Arts Lab, and it was in the middle of a road in South London. Working as I was with video, I tried rebranding the toilet cubicles into 1-person cinema rooms by creating cushioned toilet seats and giving people things to watch while they were sitting in there. I know it all looks a bit wonky, and it was my first show. We didn't have any funds, but there was actually an atmosphere about it, and quite a lot of people did actually turn up. Given that the show had to do with improvisation and the collaborations I was doing with the other artist, we had invited a jazz band we met in a pub, and they came and played in the toilet gallery for us for free. And it turned into a very special evening, in fact, that continued long into the night. The following year, I had started doing a lot of work with scripts, and I wanted to start staging this particular text I wrote. which was called A Ritual Resuscitation of Eternal Lovers. I noticed that there were quite a lot of fringe theatres in London offering test spaces for what's called new writing or experimental theatre, and I started staging this work in those contexts. So this is the Cockpit Theatre in London, and the two people reading here are volunteers from the audience who have never seen my text or met me before or read this work before. So they were spontaneously coming up from the audience to perform my work, which was part of the concept of the work as well. And because, as the title indicates, the idea of the work is that it's a kind of ritual reawakening of the two fictional lovers trapped inside of the text, it was a work that gained in its meaning from repetition. And so here the lovers appear again, this time at an art research symposium in Nottingham Contemporary in Nottingham. You can see in the background on the projection there that the archive of instances of readings was growing over the years. And this time, in this still, the work is being performed at South London Gallery, and this was in early 2021 or 2022 as part of a Bloomberg New Contemporaries event on artists who write. As I got familiar with theatrical settings, I also brought some of the performances I'd previously done on video to the stage, and this is me performing the process of becoming possessed by a fictional character at Camden People's Theatre in London. And in that performance, the character begs the audience not to forget her after I become myself again and she is lost. Some of these performances can be more cheerful and begin to take on a bit of a relationship, I think, with stand-up comedy. Here I'm performing a character who is explaining to the audience that 20% of things that happen actually don't happen. And this is at a gallery called Elephant West in London. Eventually, all this work I'd managed to get out there through open call applications was beginning to help me form links and become part of a community of practice. And sometimes these links can take a long time to form. Here was my first solo show at a gallery in southeast London. When the show was about to open, I decided to invite a curator to the opening. And this was a person who, a year before this show, had written this very, very short text about my work on his blog. He had been to a group student show that I was in, and he wrote something small about it, and it was a really important moment for me. It was the first time that anybody had said anything in writing in public about my work. So I remembered that, and a year had passed and I had this solo show, and I decided, well, he's going to be one of the people I invite to this opening. He did actually come to the show, and we chatted at the show, and then nothing happened. We parted ways. But 6 months later, he invited me to be part of a group show about artists who use comedy and silliness in their work. And that was also an important moment for me, because it was the first time I'd been invited to do something without having applied or proposed it in the first place. And these sorts of invitations become more and more common, I think, the more often you show your work publicly, because it inevitably puts you in the path of other people who then remember you and bring you in to help them with their projects, and vice versa, you also help them with their projects. And that sense of being in a community or being part of some community of artists and people in the arts wouldn't have happened without participating in public events through open calls and proposals to begin with. So to end, I am going to go back to that all-important point that beneath all these efforts to get your work out there and present yourself in public and disseminate your work, underlying all of these efforts, investment in the art practice is the most crucial thing. It's even more important than publicizing yourself or doing the whole professional practice thing. So here are a couple of notes on practice management. And again, these are two observations from my own practice. I personally find it necessary to try to uphold two particular behaviours in my art practice. The first one is continuity. And the second one is being in touch with my own thinking. Continuity is important to me because as a slippery activity that's not always easy to measure or evaluate, the art practice itself can often get sidelined by things that seem more urgent. There is a scholar called Tara Brabazon, and she has this saying, this sort of mantra that I really like. She says, "Don't prioritize what's urgent, prioritize what's important." So what's urgent and what's important, it sounds like those are the same things, but they're actually two quite different concepts, urgent and important. So in this case, the art practice is important. It's more important than applications. Even if applications actually have an urgency about them because they've got a deadline, it feels urgent, I've got to hand something in by a deadline. And art practice doesn't always feel as urgent in a way because it's something that's always there, that you can always do. It doesn't really have a deadline in and of itself, but it is more important for the reasons that we discussed earlier, that your whole professional life, it doesn't matter how many applications you send out or how you represent yourself in the public, it's ultimately all going to depend on the art practice. So the art practice is the most important thing, but applications can sometimes feel more urgent. Continuity in the art practice can get disrupted by things that seem urgent, so I have to insist on always finding some time, even just an hour, every day to practice. The other behaviour I value is being in touch with my own processes, which means being very interested in the mechanics of how my practice actually works. So looking at this picture that I've got up on the screen now, for instance, these are my notes. So these images in my notes are from a series of introspective performances that I did, and these are actually not artworks per se. Maybe they can accidentally become artworks, but they weren't intended as artworks. They're more like scientific experiments than artworks. In these, I was interested in introspecting into the exact processes by which I slip into a different character. So I made 7 video performances in which I tried to narrate aloud the process of going into character. I then went over these recordings and I made notes and I wrote an analysis of the surprising things I noticed there. And through this process, and by the way, no one ever really sees this, this is just for me. Through this process, I actually learned quite a lot about how I work. And in fact, I spend a lot of time researching my own art practice and studying it as if it were a machine that I could tinker with. Just in case it's of any interest to you, this application that I'm using here is called Obsidian. It's free and it essentially turns your notes into a kind of personal Wikipedia. So you can link your thoughts, just like on Wikipedia, different articles are linked together, so you can kind of hop between them. You can do that on this application as well with your own notes. And as an aside, I think, having an interest in technologies that enable me to be in touch with my own corpus of work is quite important as well. Some of these personal musings, these notes and so on, looking back over some of them, I might decide to turn them into public pieces of writing on creative practice. And I did attempt to do that with this blog, which I think I may have taken offline now, but It tracks the journey of my art school education and especially my thoughts on teaching. But for a while, this was something that I was publishing on the internet, also as a way of just getting feedback and sharing things that I was figuring out as well with other people. Any way of visualizing my own art practice to myself is a way of both building on my previous work and staying motivated, because when I'm recording these things, when I'm visualizing them, it's a way of being reminded of what I've already done. So sometimes it's easy to think that you don't do anything, that you haven't done anything, and keeping a bit of a record and having a way of looking back on it can actually be quite motivating, because you realise how much you do and how much you do learn as you're grappling with your art practice and developing. So to wrap up, the 3 points that this video really covered are: who pays for art determines what sort of art can be made and who it's for. So art and its funding, art and money, is actually entangled, and how art is ultimately paid for, where the money's coming from, even if it's from your own work, your own part-time job or whatever, it actually affects, it's actually part of the work. Even though we sometimes think of those two things as separate, it is implicitly shaping what kind of work you can make and how it is ultimately read by a public. The second point that this video covered is that an efficient open call application workflow has helped, at least me, to become part of a professional community, and it sort of has made it easier and easier to get involved in public presentations of my work. And the third point was that the art practice comes first, and focusing on continuity and a dedicated study of the mechanics of your own practice can lead to a sort of rigorous way of working that can hopefully give you a strong portfolio and a strong foundation from which to have some sort of professional practice to speak of. So thanks for listening.